Today at the National Press Club, the Chief Executive of Telstra, Andy Penn, as well as leading Australia's largest telecommunications company, Mr Penn is also the Chairman of the Cyber Industry Advisory Committee. Andy Penn with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to today's Westpac National Press Club address. I'm Andrew Tillett, Federal Political Correspondent for the Australian Financial Review and Vice President here at the National Press Club. Our guest today is Andy Penn, Chair of the Cyber Industry Advisory Committee and Chief Executive Officer of Telstra, with his address to the National Press Club. After a lengthy career in financial services, Mr Penn dialed up a new challenge and joined Telstra in 2012 and has been Chief Executive Officer for the past 7 years. As well as helming one of Australia's most iconic companies, Mr Penn was tapped by the former government to be its top advisor on cybersecurity from an industry perspective. He steps down as Telstra boss next month after overseeing a transformation of the company as it grappled with the NBN. So today marks a farewell appearance for Mr Penn, although who knows what the future holds. For those of you watching at home, you can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @PressClubAust. And our hashtag is NPC. Please everyone welcome Andy Penn.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and good afternoon, everybody. Can I firstly start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, the Ngunnawal country, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Can I also thank Maurice Riley and the Press Club for the opportunity to address the National Press Club today. You play a critically important role in the debate in Australia, and I'd also like to thank Ian Campbell for his kind comments earlier in our proceedings. As you heard, I'm very pleased to be here in my capacity as the CEO of Telstra, albeit I am stepping down next week after 7.5 years in that role, which has been a great privilege. And also, of course, as the Chair of the Industry Advisory Committee to the Federal Government on Cybersecurity. I also previously chaired the Industry Advisory Panel, which helped the government in the development of the 2020 cybersecurity strategy. And of course, the committee does play an important role in advising the federal government on how business, government and legislators can work together in the implementation of the strategy to build Australia's cyber defences, obviously from an industry perspective. I'd like to firstly acknowledge my committee colleagues that are here today, Deputy Chair Cathy Reid, Rachel Fulk, Kareen Best, Patrick Wright, Bevan Slashley, David Tudhope and Darren Kane that are here. But I'd also like to acknowledge and thank both Chris Deeble and Stephen Smith, who have been valuable members of the committee, and in Chris's case, the Industry Advisory Panel before that, for their commitment and contribution. Chris and Stephen are both stepping down due to their recent appointments. Chris as the Deputy Secretary in the Department of Defence, and Stephen, who is conducting a review of our nation's defence on behalf of the government. And I'm both sure that they are critically important roles, but will also include a strong focus on cyber. Can I also acknowledge the presence of my colleagues in government, whom we've worked closely with over the past few years, in particular Secretary of Home Affairs Mike Pezzullo, Deputy Secretary Mark Blong, Director General of Australian Signals Directorate Rachel Noble, the Head of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre Abigail Bradshaw, and the committee's Secretariat team within Home Affairs. I'd also like to acknowledge the Chief Minister Andrew Barr and Assistant Minister Tim Watts that are here today as well. Today I'm pleased to foreshadow the Industry Advisory Committee's second annual report, which will be released tomorrow. The report provides an overview of the strategy's implementation progress, an evaluation of the impact of the underlying initiatives, the committee's work and the changing threat landscape, and our recommendations of where progress needs to be accelerated. Cybersecurity is not just an issue for government. Everybody is at risk, and so everybody has a role to play. Our strategy to defend ourselves from those who would actively seek to do us harm has to be more than just a whole-of-government strategy. It's a whole-of-nation strategy. It's worth reflecting, though, on just how much has changed in the last 2 years since the strategy was launched. The rate of digital adoption has gone to a whole new level. Our use of technology and its ubiquity in our lives was already significant at the end of the last decade. However, COVID has taught us the convenience of doing things online, and we can now study and work from home very effectively. The implications of the last couple of years have therefore dramatically accelerated the trend in digital adoption, some say by more than 10 years in just the last 2. And at the same time, we are also on the cusp of another great leap forward in technology innovation, as a number of new technologies are reaching a point where together they will enable a whole new world. A world of billions of people and businesses connected by lightning-fast 5G communications, and by the end of this decade, 6G. A world with unprecedented computer processing power, storage capacity, access to unlimited knowledge from cloud and edge computing. A world of multiplying possibilities from artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things. The new digital metaverse, robotics, autonomous vehicles, nanotechnology, and quantum computing. The geopolitical environment is also far more fractious than most of us have seen in our lifetimes, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and tensions in the South China Sea, and more broadly in the Indo-Pacific region. And of course, we are seeing, therefore, a significant increase in cyber threats. At Telstra, we've been working around the clock to protect our networks, blocking unprecedented levels of malicious activity. In the last 12 months alone, we have blocked more than 1 billion malicious emails, 200 million scam calls. We're currently blocking more than 1,500 malicious SMS texts every minute. The bottom line is that at exactly the time that we've become more dependent than ever on doing things digitally, and that dynamic is only going to increase, the digital platforms and digital infrastructure on which we rely are at most risk. A risk from cyber threat, at risk from ability to access critical technologies where the supply chains have become a geopolitical dynamic, and at risk from bifurcating technology standards that will threaten the interoperability of technologies that today we just take for granted. I'm going to come back to some of these themes later, but let me start by taking you through the current cyber threat landscape. Over the last 12 months, the global cyber threat environment has intensified significantly. And make no mistake, Australia is an attractive and active target for malicious actors and cyber criminals. New technologies and the move to more time online has created more opportunities for cyber criminals to do us harm. It has also created an increase in the attack surface for them to target. The risks of attack on Australian networks from geopolitical tensions, whether directly or inadvertently, has also increased. And whether the threat of cyber attacks from state actors is real or not, it is the knock-on effects that represent significant risks for consumers, as malicious actors and cyber criminals take advantage of the vulnerabilities exposed and exploited by state actors. These heightened cyber threats are playing out in a number of areas. For business, ransomware is a major and escalating issue. Most ransomware attacks involve malicious software being introduced into victim systems environment that encrypts target files, rendering them unusable until a ransom is paid. Unless the business has current offline backups, which can be restored quickly, and too many don't, the business operations are seriously compromised, and in some cases, the businesses are unable to trade at all. Ransomware gangs are also now using the double extortion technique, where a copy of the business's data is exfiltrated and stolen first before it is encrypted. This means that even if the victim can restore the system's environment from a backup, they have the double jeopardy of crucial and sensitive data being published online on the dark web if a ransom isn't paid. It is estimated that about 80% of Australian businesses experienced a ransomware attack in 2021, up from 45% the year before. Globally in 2020, more than $18 billion was made in ransomware payments to malicious actors. It's big business, with the largest single ransomware payment ever being made of US $40 million. And even where ransomware payments are made, it is estimated that only around a third of the data that was stolen is ever actually recovered. Not surprisingly, therefore, ransomware victims are not hard to find. In February 2020, logistics company Toll became the victim of the Mail2 ransomware attack. The attack took many of Toll's core systems offline, forcing the company to resort to manual procedures and causing major delivery delays. Some weeks later, and just after the company had managed to get back on its feet again, it was attacked. This time the attackers also stole 200 gigabytes of data and started publishing it on the dark web in what I described earlier as the double extortion technique. Toll did not ultimately pay the ransom, but its operations and its customers were severely affected, and it extended to many of key supply chains that exist in the country. In May 2021, as we know, a ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline, which carries almost half the fuel supplies to power the east coast of the United States, resulted in the company shutting down its systems. Starved of fuel, many US states declared a state of emergency. In July 2021, ransomware actors targeted a vulnerability in software used by IT solutions developer Kaseya. Many companies were affected, including the Swedish supermarket giant Co-op, which closed the whole of its 800-store network across the country. In May this year, the cyber criminals attacked the IT systems belonging to the Costa Rican government, threatening to overthrow the government if a ransom wasn't paid. The president declared a state of emergency, and a subsequent attack a month later shut down the health services across the country. Globally, without prevention, deterrence and response mechanisms in place, it is estimated that ransomware will cost victims more than $265 billion annually in the next 10 years. Another rapidly growing area of cyber risk is business email compromise, particularly an issue for small to medium-sized businesses. Business email compromise is when attackers use email to masquerade as legitimate business, sending messages designed to deceive recipients into sending money or goods to the attacker. Common examples include invoice fraud, impersonation and gift card scams, but ploys can take many forms. And as I mentioned earlier, Telstra has blocked more than 1 billion malicious emails in the last 12 months alone. Although incidences are almost certainly underreported, it is believed that Australians lost more than $80 million to this type of attack in the 2021 financial year. Another growing area of concern is mobile malware. As mobile devices have become more powerful and sophisticated, people are using them for far many activities. Personally, of the time that I spend on a computer, only 5% would be on my desktop. The other 95% is on a mobile device, either my phone or my iPad. We do business on our phones, we do our banking on our phones, we shop on our phones, we watch the news on our phones, and we connect with family and friends on our phones. Australia has one of the largest and highest incidences of smartphone penetration globally at almost 80%, including more than a third of all children between the age of 6 and 13. On average, Australians spend more than 2.5 hours a day on their smartphones. This is creating a larger population of users and opportunities for cyber criminals to target, and a corresponding increase in smartphone malware. The majority of mobile malware is used to steal usernames and passwords or for emails and bank accounts, but many forms today are equipped with invasive snooping capabilities to record audio and video and track locations and wipe user content. Many Australians have received scam text messages about missed calls, voicemails, deliveries and photo uploads carrying a malicious link that will download a FluBot malware if clicked. And the FluBot malware, of course, enables cyber criminals to steal banking and contact and personal information from an infected device. Another dynamic increasing in frequency is the exposure of vulnerabilities resident in software used ubiquitously around the world. I mentioned earlier that these vulnerabilities are often exposed by sophisticated state-based actors, but then they are exploited by cyber criminals. Australian networks have suffered collateral impacts from widespread espionage campaigns where various actors sought to rapidly and indiscriminately exploit newly published vulnerabilities, including in Microsoft Exchange and the Log4j script, amongst others. These campaigns are becoming increasingly regular part of the cybersecurity landscape. Timely patching of critical vulnerabilities and organisations configuring their networks and computers to minimise the impact of malicious software spreading throughout the network remain effective in protecting yourself. As well as the caution, though, of running your day-to-day business, organisations also need to be thoughtful and careful when conducting M&A activities. At Telstra, we have seen somewhat of this firsthand. In 2015, we acquired PacNet, which has extensive network infrastructure in the Asia-Pacific region, including extensive submarine cables, which are crucial for transmitting sensitive and significant data internationally. We had done due diligence on the company 6 months before we completed the acquisition. However, you do not usually get direct access to the company's network or systems when you're doing due diligence, and therefore you tend to have to rely on the representations and the warranties of the vendor. So, not surprisingly, the day after we took over PacNet, our cyber team went in and did a very deep end-to-end scan and, sure enough, identified multiple incidences of malware resident in its systems. We've also just completed the acquisition of Digicel in partnership with the Australian Government. Digicel is the largest leading operator in 6 countries in the Pacific region for mobile telecommunications, including in Papua New Guinea. And yes, we identified multiple incidences of malware resident in its systems. Now, fortunately, our cyber team is very experienced and we are able to clean the networks and systems of any companies that we acquire before we connect them to our networks. However, you would be surprised how many companies are not able to do this or do not do this, and therefore find that malware comes and infects their whole networks through a company that they've acquired. These are very real threats, and of course they therefore need very real action. And the environment therefore underscores the importance of the work that has been done under the 2020 Australian Cyber Security Strategy to date. The recent appointment of Australia's first Cabinet Minister for Cyber Security, Claire O'Neill, also the Minister for Home Affairs, reflects the new government's recognition that cyber security is a national priority. It provides an excellent opportunity to enhance coordination across government on cyber policy, strategy and response mechanisms. Since its launch in August of 2020, the Cyber Security Strategy has established a solid framework and progress has been made in a number of key areas over the last year, including in establishing cybersecurity minimum standards and new information sharing obligations for operators of critical infrastructure, in enhancing incident response procedures across governments and industry, in developing the Cyber Enhanced Situational Awareness Response Package to support the activities of the Australian Signals Directorate and their cyber capabilities, in increasing capabilities of the Australian Federal Police to counter cybercrime, including, importantly, new powers to attack and disrupt child exploitation on the dark web, in boosting cyber resilience and awareness campaigns targeted at the Australian public, in the release of the Ransomware Action Plan in October of last year, in providing expanded resources, advice and guidance materials to small and medium enterprises in Australia, and in making some progress in hardening Australia's government's own IT systems. Additional and complementary work is also underway to improve cyber skills, international engagement and technical capabilities via other streams of work across government. This includes the International Cyber and Critical Technology Engagement Strategy under the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and I'd like to acknowledge Tony Feakin, the Ambassador for Cyber Affairs and Critical Technology here today, for his leadership in developing this important work. The government has also announced its intention to invest nearly $10 billion over the next 10 years in REDSPICE, which will be delivered by the Australian Signals Directorate. The REDSPICE Program is in response to the deteriorating strategic environment in the Indo-Pacific region, which is far more complex and far less predictable than any time since the Second World War. Throughout recent years, Australia has been the target of a range of actors conducting cyber operations that pose a significant threat to our security. REDSPICE will enhance the intelligence capabilities of the ASD and grow our cyber defences. It will double ASD's analytical workforce and persistent cyber hunt activities and national cyber response capability. It also incorporates some of the initiatives that were previously in the CESA program, moving them forward in time and expanding them. And as part of this, ASD will have significantly larger footprints in Melbourne, Brisbane and Perth, encapsulating the smaller joint cybersecurity centres currently in those cities. So, a lot has been delivered or is in the pipeline to improve our cyber defences. However, notwithstanding this progress, there are crucial areas where more needs to be done, either because insufficient progress has been made or because of the evolving threat landscape. So in its report, the committee has identified a number of areas where progress needs to be accelerated. But I would like to comment on 6 in particular. Firstly, hardening government's own IT systems. One of the key aims of the strategy is for government to substantially lift the level of cyber security resilience across its own operations. Government systems continue to be the prime target of malicious actors, and there have been many attacks directed at government, such as the state and federal level. These attacks targeting service delivery agencies, government departments and political offices. A lot of work under the cyber security strategy to date has been focused on what business needs to do to improve its cyber defences, particularly critical infrastructure operators. At the same time, however, it is important that the government makes progress to harden its own systems and cyber defences. In asking Australians and Australia businesses to support the strategy, the government needs to be a role model in its own operations, in adopting the Essential 8 model and improving security, increasing digital government service delivery. The cyber hubs have been established to lead this and coordinated by the government's Digital Transformation Agency need to be given more teeth, and their work needs to be accelerated. Secondly, it is crucial that the government maintains industry engagement and consultation in the development of industry regulations for critical infrastructure and systems of national significance. This legislation is the cornerstone of the strategy, and industry consultation will be crucial to it being embraced over the longer term by business. For most of the 11 sectors identified as critical infrastructure, other than telecommunications and financial services, the nature of these obligations is relatively new. The supporting regulations, therefore, and any future amendments will need to be carefully designed and implemented in partnership and consultation to reflect the specific dynamics and state of progress of each industry sector. Thirdly, governance and measurement. The 2020 Cybersecurity Strategy is a significant body of work. It comprises almost 50 specific programs of work aimed at government, industry and the broader community. Strong management and monitoring of the progress of each of these programs and its initiatives is essential to ensure their success. It is the committee's view that the current framework of evaluation and measurement is not yet sufficient for a program of this scale. Developing an empirical data-driven evaluation system of Australia's cybersecurity maturity has to be a key and consistent recommendation from the committee since its inception. Without a rigorous evaluation and measurement system, government can only rely on anecdote and commentary to determine the progress and effectiveness of initiatives under the strategy. It's a crucial strategy for our security, and we need to be able to point to proof points and data to ensure confidence in the successful implementation of it. The fourth priority is threat sharing and government and industry collaboration, both crucial to improving Australia's defences. The government's Cyber Threat Information Sharing Platform, or CTIS, will help address long-standing industry requests for improved threat sharing indicators. Now the development of the platform is out of its pilot stage, the priority must be for both government and industry to work together to get as many organisations enlisted as possible. It will also need the allocation of dedicated resources to ensure continuous quality assurance. Threat sharing is the key to threat blocking, and threat blocking is the key to cleaner pipes and a safer online digital world for everybody. The CTIS platform is an initiative of the Australian Cyber Security Centre. Another important initiative of the Australian Cyber Security Centre is the Joint Cyber Security Centres, which were originally created under the 2016 Cybersecurity Strategy. They are also key vehicles to increase collaboration between government and industry at the federal, state and territory levels. The progress in establishing and maturing the JCSCs has been more protracted than we had hoped it would be, but the important REDSPICE Program is now an opportunity to leverage and accelerate these. Ensuring industry leaders also remain key partners in the governance and directional focus of the JCSCs will enable the government to maintain focus on what the pressing issues are across industry. The fifth priority is the Best Practice Regulation Task Force. The purpose of this task force work in 2021 was to consider, in consultation with industry and other stakeholders, what changes or clarifications may be required to existing legislation to address cybersecurity issues. The work is aimed at businesses not covered by the CISON's reforms. The task force in particular explored whether legislation under corporations law, consumer or privacy laws, for example, sufficiently captured responsibilities and accountabilities in relation to cybersecurity. For example, a business that sells digital products and services, what obligations does that business have to ensure those products and services have cyber security fit for purpose for their use? How is that defined and where is that articulated? In July 2021, the task force consulted with industry over a 7-week period and subsequently reported to government. However, there has been no feedback to industry yet, and given the time that has passed, government should prioritise providing industry with its conclusions from this work, including any gaps in current legislation and any proposed initiatives or changes that are being considered. It has been the committee's view that any intervention should minimise legislative change and focus on voluntary industry standards. This is an important body of work which is going to be crucial to the further protection of consumers in Australia. And finally, awareness raising. While there are clearly very sophisticated malicious actors out there deploying tactics that are very hard to detect, the reality is the overwhelming majority of attacks could be avoided or their consequences mitigated by a better informed and more cyber-aware community. It is very often the human error that malicious actors target and are able to exploit. Clicking a link, putting a malware-infected USB into a desktop, not properly protecting passwords or other personal information. As I have set out, the volume of malicious activity is increasing rapidly, and many of the programs in the strategy are aimed at hardening Australia's systems and defences against these. Whilst these programs include identifying and blocking malicious activity before it reaches the public, we will never be able to stop everything. Therefore, it is critical that individual awareness is raised and good cyber defence hygiene practices are in place to protect people. Now, there have been a number of cyber awareness campaigns and initiatives launched under the strategy, and their results are actually very positive. However, the resources and investments being committed to them is too small when considered in the context of the scale of the challenge, the investment in the strategy overall, and the extent to which awareness can make a difference. The committee believes that a focus on these 6 key priorities is critical in the year ahead from a cybersecurity perspective and under the current 2020 cybersecurity strategy. At the same time, however, it is important to recognise and understand the fragility of our digital platforms is not only at risk from cyber attack. While cyber is a major factor, there are other key issues affecting our long-term security and of our digital future, and these need to be taken into account through broadening the strategy in the future. 2 in particular are of concern to the committee. Firstly, supply chains for critical technologies, and secondly, global standards for technology. And I want to comment on both of these. Geopolitics and global economics are now playing a major role in the supply chain of critical technologies on which our technological future depends. Providing a synopsis of what is happening geopolitically and economically is beyond the scope of my remarks, but I think we can all just see how much the world has changed dramatically in this regard over the last few years. The point I do want to elaborate on, though, is how this is playing out in the supply chain of critical technology. Critical technologies have become an increasingly important focus at a political level, with many countries, including Australia, bringing access and long-term supply of critical technologies much more centrally to the policy and national security agendas. The simple fact is that if our future is going to be defined technologically, our access to and the resilience of our technology systems is now an issue of national importance. Let me direct us to 2 specific technologies to highlight my point: 5G radio access telecommunications equipment and semiconductors. 5G is what keeps us connected, and semiconductors are a key component in every technology today. In a new car, for example, there can be as many as 3,000 microchips to power touchscreens, engine controls, driver assistance cameras, and many other systems. Australia has no material sovereign manufacturing capability of either 5G or semiconductors, so we are completely dependent on offshore supply chains. Over the last 2 decades, the supply chains of both of these technologies has become increasingly concentrated to the point where there are only a handful of manufacturers in the world today. There are even fewer in the Western world. Now, as you can imagine, these technologies take decades to develop, decades of innovation, patent creation, and of course, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment. Suffice it to say, they cannot be replaced quickly or easily. Any reversal of this trend must therefore tackle this issue. In other words, governments, including the Australian government, are going to need to be more hands-on than they have ever been in the field of technology, particularly critical technology. Issues of national security and prosperity are matters for government, and of course governments are the ones who are responsible for the development of policy, legislation and regulation. However, the reality is today, technology innovation, technology development and technology operation is predominantly in the private sector. These two interests, therefore, need to work much more closely together in the future than they have in the past. This was the same message that Admiral Mike Rogers, former head of the US National Security Agency and Second Commander of the United States Cyber Command, made just a few weeks ago when he was here at the Press Club. Mike's number one concern is exactly this: the need for government and industry to come together much more closely to secure our technological future. A study in the US in 2019 looking into research and development trends since the Second World War found that the overall level of R&D investment in the US as a percentage of GDP had broadly stayed the same. However, the proportion that had been invested by government had more than halved, and the proportion that had been invested by business had more than doubled. The challenge with this is that governments and businesses' priorities are not always fully aligned. Businesses account to shareholders who are looking for an economic return, and increasingly a shorter-term economic return. Consequently, the focus of R&D has been relatively less driven by priorities of government, which include matters of national interest and security. Not surprisingly, we're now starting to see the reality and the consequence of this dawning on policymakers, and the approach towards policy and investment is starting to change. For example, Australia was officially the first country in the world to limit from whom telecommunications companies could acquire 5G radio access telecommunications equipment. Several other nations have since followed suit. It's significant also that President Biden recently announced a $250 billion package of investment from the US government that covers activities ranging from artificial intelligence, quantum computing. The investment also includes a staggering $52 billion to boost national production of semiconductors. That is more than Australia spent on the whole of the NBN. Probably nearly as much as we spent too, by the way. But in the announcement, the President said, "We are in competition to win the 21st century and the starting gun has gone off. As other countries continue to invest in their own research and development, we cannot risk to fall behind." Australia cannot risk falling behind either. The second issue adding to the fragility of our digital platforms and digital future is the setting of global standards around connected digital technologies. We live in a world where we almost take for granted that we will be able to access the internet wherever we like and whenever we like. That everything will be interoperable. That when we go overseas, our mobiles and laptops will work in different countries. That our information, payment and our other systems will work seamlessly in a ubiquitous world. But of course, that doesn't happen by accident. For almost every technology today, there are global standards to ensure that all parts of the technology system are building in a way that ultimately you and I can use them interoperably. But again, geopolitical rivalries threaten this, and there is a real risk that this could lead to a bifurcation in global standards around things like the internet, mobile phone technologies, and privacy standards. Two sets of global standards would mean competing interests satellite and telecommunication networks, hardware and operating systems. The costs in every sense would be enormous, and it would put an end to a globalised value chain with all its many benefits in terms of cost innovation and compatibility. This is a significant challenge for Australian policymakers and their international peers. It will require skillful diplomacy that is perceptive around governance and standard-setting processes. It will require careful navigation of complex geopolitical, technical and economic landscape issues and tensions. And it will require reimagining how policies are set within a technology framework. And this, of course, is one of the key objectives of the International Cyber and Critical Technology Engagement Strategy that I mentioned earlier. Finally, before concluding, I wanted to comment on one other topic, and that is skills in the workplace. If we are to meet all of these challenges and thrive in the accelerating digital world, we're going to need to substantially lift our level of cybersecurity skills. And we're going to need to do this right the way across the spectrum, whether that's deep cyber expertise or just basic cyber hygiene. Through our schools and our universities, our governments and industry, and we're going to need to do this fast. Cyber needs to be a key topic in the Jobs and Skills Summit next week, and the cybersecurity strategy needs to be expanded to more fully embrace this challenge in the future. So with that, let me conclude. And I want to finish where I started. Technology innovation offers Australia and Australians huge opportunities in productivity, in new discoveries, new products and services, improved customer experiences, more efficient cities, better health outcomes, and so many other areas. However, the promise of the digital economy is not guaranteed. In fact, while the security of our digital infrastructure and platforms has never been more important, it has also never been more fragile. Not only are they at risk from cyber attack, but they are also exposed to other risks including access to critical technologies such as 5G and semiconductors, the risk of maintaining interoperability from the threat of bifurcation of global standards, and the risk of inadequacy of our skills base to meet these challenges, but also to capitalise on the opportunities. We therefore applaud the Minister's decision to shape a broader national cybersecurity strategy through this lens, a step which will be critical in building and protecting Australians and Australia's sovereign capability. As Australia continues to navigate an increasingly complex cyber threat landscape, now is the appropriate time to refresh and expand the strategy, and the committee looks forward to continuing to work with the government and to support it in so doing. A lot is at stake, and we need to work together, and we need to do that fast. As a country, we need to deeply understand these dynamics and their potential impact on the technology upon which we rely. As a country, we need to prioritise the policies and strategies that create a coordinated and integrated response. And as a country, I cannot think of a more important time to engage in this discussion than now. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, for that speech. You mentioned towards the end there about the skills challenge facing the cyber industry. All the talk in Canberra next week. The hottest ticket in town will be the Jobs and Skills Summit held by the government next week. First of all, what would Telstra as a sort of a company like to see come out of that summit? And if you then pivot onto the cyber skills challenge and what we actually need to do, is it simple as importing a lot of people in the short term, foreign workers in the short term?
Well, look, I think firstly there's no single solution here. Obviously, if you look at the scale and the magnitude of what we need from a skills perspective, we need multiples of interventions. To put this in perspective, we have somewhere in the order of 800 cyber professionals working at Telstra who have deep expertise. But the other dynamic I would say is that we also need to more build into our basic curriculums just basic cyber awareness. So areas such as robotics, software engineering, data analytics, data and science, because if you think about it, a cyber specialist is usually coming in after the event and trying to fix a problem, whereas in fact we can actually build cyber security more into the products and services from the beginning, and that means, as I say, building that into some of those core curriculums that will make a substantial difference. So it's anywhere from curriculums from school through to universities. It's visas. It's immigration. It's micro-credentialing within universities. I think there are multiples of different interventions that we can take to accelerate and lift the level of cyber capability within the country.
And on the summit itself, what would Telstra like to sort of see? What are the things that...
Well, I think what we would like to see is really cyber being a very sort of anchor part of the whole digital conversation. We were talking just earlier today around the concept of cybercrime as an issue, and actually increasingly there is no crime that happens in Australia that doesn't actually have some element of a digital involvement in it, or some element of digital footprint. So it is just becoming front and centre of every aspect of our society and operating digitally.
Okay, thank you. Our first question today is from Sarah Ison.
Sarah Ison from The Australian, thank you for your speech. If I can just ask a couple, following on from Andrew's question about the Skills Summit. New energy and sort of clean energy is a big focus of the summit. There's new energy apprentices, a lot of that focus on that. Do you want to see a similar sort of lens, you know, a cybersecurity traineeship, apprenticeship, that sort of thing being really, really central to the summit? And secondly, if I can, in the Internet 2.0, that Canberra-based cybersecurity firm found TikTok used an excessive amount of data, according to an analysis last month. How concerning is this for Telstra? Is the company doing anything? And I note, of course, Telstra has its own quite successful TikTok platform. So just those two, if I may.
Yeah, well, maybe if I deal with the second one first.
Sure.
I mean, you know, social media is a great way for people to connect and and also for organisations to engage with their communities and their customers with. So we use, as you say, we use many social media platforms as well. Our key focus is on ensuring that there is no sort of hidden malicious activity occurring in the data that goes over our networks, and so that's where we invest an enormous amount of time and money on what we call cleaner pipes, which is really trying to identify the malicious traffic that could be, or sorry, rather the traffic that could be malicious, whether that's arriving via social media, text, business email compromise, scam calls, or otherwise. Otherwise we support obviously those social media platforms as best we can, providing we're also complying with our obligations around abhorrent content, and we have responsibilities in that regard as well.
Does TikTok threaten those clean pipes? Can I be clear?
I don't know that TikTok threatens them any more than any other platform. I think what we see in the world today is very sophisticated, malicious cyber actors, which will take any successful platform and use that as an opportunity to trick customers into clicking a link and downloading malicious malware. I think in a sense, any platform that is successful is going to attract more attention from a cyber criminal.
Okay, and just on the first one.
And then going back to the first sort of question, yes, I mean I think that it is both specialist cyber skills where we need to build the pipeline, but as I mentioned as well, I think as important is building, base cyber skills into core curriculums in the digital world. And in fact, if one thinks about it, there isn't many professions today that exist which don't also exist substantially online. And so any business that's building a digital product and service needs to be able to build into that digital product and service the appropriate level of cybersecurity.
Thank you.
Next question from Julie Hare.
Thank you, Mr. Penn. I enjoyed your speech. Julie Hare from the Australian Financial Review, and I'm also a director of the National Press Club. The School Summit, Jobs and School Summit, is very much the topic du jour, so excuse us. We've heard from business loud and clear that their number one priority from the Jobs Summit is a lift in migration, but beyond that short-term imperative, there is not a united front in terms of priority from the nation's employers. How worried are you that business will get drowned out by unions who have the ear of government and are putting forward a range of medium and longer-term proposals? And would you like to propose any other labour market fixes beyond migration?
Yeah, no, look, I'm certainly not worried that government or the discussion or business is going to get drowned out by unions. I mean, I think for us, the government and industry is very aligned in, if I see that through the lens of my work with government on the digital economy and also on cybersecurity. I think we're very aligned in the criticality of ensuring Australia has the skills to respond to the demand that we have for digital expertise. I think, as I say, it's not going to be any one single solution. Yes, migration is the one that typically gets thrown in there, but I actually think looking at core approach to curriculums within our academic institutions across the country, building in basic cyber awareness and cyber hygiene, and also cyber safety skills into school curriculums is equally important as well.
Okay, thank you.
You mentioned Digicel during your speech. Telstra did the government a bit of a favour there by coming to the party and sort of buying it with the assistance of taxpayers. We've seen the reports last week in the Solomon Islands of plans there with Huawei to build dozens of towers in the Sollies. This would probably be better at your successor, but do you imagine that Telstra will sort of play a bigger role in regional telco infrastructure in the Pacific? Digicel may be the first of sort of future deals, perhaps.
Well, look, Telstra is already a very significant telco operator in the Indo-Pacific region. The digital acquisition is an acquisition of a significant mobile operator, as I mentioned, in 6 markets, particularly Papua New Guinea. But what you don't see is below the surface of the water is a very, very extensive submarine cable network, which is key in transporting data and information and internet traffic within the region and outside of the region. In fact, we carry about 1/3 of all internet traffic in the broader Asia-Pacific region, and so that is pretty substantial. We last year announced we're building the new ground stations for Viasat's Series 3 Asia-Pacific satellite, all of which will be based, the ground station that is, all of which will be based in Australia. And I think that as we move forward into an increasingly digitally connected world, I think everybody's becoming more aware that actually what sits beneath us all accessing the internet and doing things online is actually a lot of infrastructure. A lot of the infrastructure is telecommunications and increasingly, of course, cloud computing as well. And so I think it's become incredibly sensitive and strategically important for companies and for governments. And so hence, we will continue to work very closely with the Australian government, who obviously is key focus is in relation to national security, and we'll do everything we can to collaborate and support that so that we protect our customers at the same time.
Thank you. Next question, Marion Ray.
Yes, Marion Ray, Future Economies correspondent at AAP. Last time I asked you about space. This time I want to bring it down a bit, talk about the cloud, which is actually not clouds, but based on boring massive banks of servers and the cables you've mentioned, and also highly dependent on energy. And there's talk that Australia could be a future industry could be massive data centres, mega green data banks. What sort of new cyber threats does that bring, or is the greater challenge actually the new sources of energy? And should that be a future area of business for Telstra?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, in a sense, it already is an area of business. We already do provide some cloud and data centre services as well. And to the point, we provide the cable connectivity to them as well. In fact, just very recently, we announced a very significant transaction with Microsoft, who will become an anchor tenant on our new intercapital fibre network, which is basically them using that to transmit data in and out of their cloud and data centres. So certainly opportunities for Telstra, and certainly an area that we're investing in. In the threat that it presents from a cybersecurity perspective, like in many things in life, of course, it's both a threat and an opportunity. The opportunity is that what we tend to find is that if businesses, particularly small, medium businesses, move a lot of their applications to the cloud, generally speaking, those applications are managed in a way which enhances the cybersecurity because the patches are made more regularly, and as opposed to those applications remaining on-prem for a small, medium business. Of course, though, that it does concentrate the data as well, and so we have to make sure we have appropriate critical infrastructure protection in place for them, which is why in the new SISONs or the new SOCI updated security of critical infrastructure amendments, data storage is one of those critical technologies where there will be increased obligations for operators to threat share and to have more sort of detailed plans and obligations to report instances and the like. And so I think cloud net of it is it provides opportunities for our digital economy and to improve security. On the energy point as well, of course, yes, running large-scale data centres, indeed running large-scale telecommunications, also drives a lot of energy, so it adds a challenge there. But of course, the flip side is that people doing things digitally, generally speaking, is an offset to them doing things physically, which also has a compensatory impact on the environment as well.
Thank you. Next question is from Simon Gross.
Simon Gross, Canberra IQ. There's a very critical blind spot in the discussion of cybersecurity, and it was reflected in your speech, and that's law enforcement and justice. I'll quote from an ASD Cybersecurity Centre report a couple of months ago. Malware developers benefit from lucrative cyber operations with low risk of negative consequences. Many malware developers often operate from locations with few legal prohibitions against malware development and deployment. It goes on. So we don't need to go through the details of the foreign context we're in and the problems of global law enforcement in this area. Do you see any prospect that this could change, or are we just going to have to do defences rather than enforcement?
Well, I think we should obviously always attempt to do both, but as you point out and as the report highlights, unfortunately, I think as we all know, many of these malicious attacks actually originate from offshore, from jurisdictions over which our agencies don't have any rights whatsoever. There is, however, a lot of work happening internationally with like-minded nations to collaborate and to coordinate crime-fighting activities. In the cybersecurity strategy as well, there are changes to powers which actually assist agencies such as ASD disrupt offshore cybercrime. There are investments in the Australian Federal Police to build their capability. The new JP3 Centre, which is a joint policing capability, as well, has been established. So I don't think we should give up hope in any respect in terms of our various different agencies fighting cybercrime. But the challenge, as I always describe it, if you wanted to rob a bank 100 years ago, you'd come down the high street and you'd knock on the door and the money would be in the safe at the back. Unfortunately, now you can rob a bank from anywhere in the world, and that's sort of metaphorically what's happening, and that's the challenge.
One of the things you mentioned in your speech at length was about the semiconductors. We've seen in recent times with Taiwan the concerns around that, and that is one of the major producers of semiconductors in the world. It sort of highlighted the vulnerability there. You referred to the US amping up the construction of semiconductors. Is Australia in a position to do the same, to build them here, even though we have a small market and we don't build in products like cars, for instance, where semiconductors go into?
Well, there's basically only 3 manufacturers of semiconductors in the world today. That's TSMC, Samsung and Intel in the US. Building a semiconductor plant is at least a $20 billion investment and multiple years of building. It's already dependent on years of IP creation and innovation, so it would be incredibly difficult to replicate that. In fact, the trend has been in the opposite direction. Over the last 20 years, the number of manufacturers of semiconductors has probably declined for more than double digits to the 3 we have today. Same with, by the way, 5G radio access equipment. When we launched 4G in the early 2011, 2010, there were 12 companies in the world from which you could buy 5G radio access telecommunications equipment. Today there are 4.5, of which only 2 are in the Western world. And so that is what we have seen. This is my point earlier about access to critical technologies. I could go through the long stories as to how we've got to the world that we're in today, but the reality is the supply chains have become incredibly concentrated. Where Australia does play a role, though, I believe, is whilst I don't really see us ever becoming a serious manufacturer. And both of those, where we do play a role, is we have deep technical expertise and very close partnerships, and very well regarded both at the government level, but government should speak for itself, but also at the business level as well. If you take Telstra as an example, we're regarded as one of the top 2 or 3 telecommunications companies technologically in the world. So our partnerships with people like Intel and Ericsson, who are developing this technology, puts us in a position of being able to influence their product roadmaps and how they build their capabilities and solutions, which, by the way, Australia does have particular requirements for, just given the nature of the topography and the demography of the country. So we need to continue to invest in that intellectual capital to be part of the global discussion, the global debate, so that we can increasingly make sure that we ensure our access to supply of those technologies. And TSMC is, by the way, the largest producer in the world. It's not just one of the biggest, it is the biggest.
Yeah, cool. Next question, James Riley.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Andy, for the presentation. Very interesting. I'm James Riley from innovationoz.com. I had a couple of questions about sovereign capability and domestic capability and the difference therein. I'm glad you asked about semiconductors. So just to be clear, would you support government supporting an Intel or one of the others setting up in Australia to help kind of build that capacity? So that's the first thing. On the other, cybersecurity is obviously a huge challenge and therefore a huge opportunity, as you've said. From your vantage point as the chair of the Cybersecurity Committee, does government do enough in terms of the procurement levers in buying Australian-developed, sovereign-controlled tech and services to build that kind of capability to create jobs, build wealth, build companies?
Yeah, no, thank you. Look, I think in relation to the first, as I mentioned, the Biden administration has announced a $52 billion investment in supporting semiconductor manufacturing. Most of that will probably end up in the hands of Intel. They've announced their first fabrication plant build was going to be in Ohio, and the next one is in Germany. I'm not aware of any detailed discussions in relation to Australia, but they are very, very significant investments. But I think that's a question probably better directed to the government. I think as regards to the government's own procurement practices, we work very closely, obviously, with government, and I think that particularly around sensitive technologies, there is very much a bias within government to support local capability and local technology, and I think we see that as well through other procurement activities across government as well. I mean, albeit government ultimately has to play with an even hand as well, so it's a delicate place to operate, but that's probably what I would say, and direct you otherwise to our colleagues from government that are here.
Thank you. And our final question for today is from Justin Hendry, who earlier was announced as the winner of the ASG Excellence in IT Journalism Award. So,
hi Andy, thanks for the update, I guess. So last year you urged the then government to have a stronger position on ransomware, a stronger policy position, and I think then you described it as one of the most important things to address over the next 12 months. Given that those 12 months have now come and gone and the threat environment, I guess, has changed significantly in that time, how urgent is it for the government to address those issues and through legislation, and what do you see that looking like?
Yeah, no, thank you, and congratulations to me too. Well done on the award. Look, ransomware, unfortunately, is a very significant issue, particularly for businesses. There has been quite a bit of work over the last year. The government issued its ransomware action plan with a number of recommendations in there. And then also, I know the Australian Cybersecurity Centre puts out a lot of advisory to businesses, and I know businesses ourselves, we help a lot of customers with ransomware attacks as well. Ultimately, I think the single biggest lever that we have to pull is in community awareness, because ransomware generally will end up in someone's systems or computer or desktop or laptop or whatever it may be through some form of introduced malware. That malware will either be introduced by somebody clicking a link or otherwise maybe somebody putting a infected USB into their computer, or it might be through a worm from another source, such as the one I mentioned. You buy a company and then all of a sudden you've got a malware. And we can do a lot to try and identify the malicious activity and block it, but unless we can actually help the community help themselves by better password protection, patching systems, offline backups, we're never going to be able to catch everything. So the one area where we do call out where we think that government could invest more in the context of the overall scale of the strategy, is in community awareness. The campaigns that the government has so far launched have been actually shown some really, really promising results. But if you look at the level of investment in the context of the broader investment in cybersecurity, I think it's small relative to the benefit that it could have.
Thank you.
Yeah. Andy Penn, thank you for your time today. If everyone could join me in thanking Andy. And no one leaves the Press Club empty-handed. A perpetual lifetime membership card with the car park privileges, and from one iconic Australian company to another Australian runner of an Australian iconic company. Thank you for your.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for your support.